Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Child's Gallery Virtual Artist Talk with Lee Essex Doyle as she discusses her current exhibition, Dancing on the Ceiling, which is on view through this Sunday, March 10th. Thank you for joining us. My name is Richard Baiano, and I'm president of Child's Gallery. The exhibition is currently on view in the gallery. We are open Tuesday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and Saturday and Sunday, 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. We hope you will come in for the last few days of the show. It's been a very exciting exhibition for us. So I'm going to introduce Lee Essex Doyle shortly. There will be a question and answer opportunity following the discussion that I have with Lee. This is a webinar format, so please feel free to submit questions via the chat feature during the presentation. So a little bit about Lee. In addition to Lee being one of our gallery artists since 2012, which is already 12 years ago, her first solo exhibition with us was called Dreams of Dondridge. Lee is a very good friend of mine, and we've known each other for years through Save Venice, which is an organization which raises money to restore art in Venice. You'll notice as during the conversation that travel is a central component to Lee's work, and that's because Lee spent most of her childhood in East Africa, and so travel is something that has been a part of her life from the very beginning. So this exhibition, called Dancing on the Ceiling, explores Lee's mastery of light, color, and pattern. It is on full display in her latest series of mixed media paintings. These luminous paintings depict jewel-like lanterns and radiant chandeliers, architectural details drawn from her extensive travels across India, Africa, and Europe. Doyle deftly captures the play of light and shadow across richly patterned surfaces, blurring the line between representation and abstraction to dazzling effect. As I was saying, Lee has spent much of her life traveling, and I want to start with a quote that is from your website, Lee, where you say, "A finished painting is the act of fixing in time an impression of millions of feelings, thoughts, images, and longing. And like all memories, there are so many versions that are true." So here we have just a few images of Lee in her travels. I'm going to briefly just walk you through the installation in the gallery, which you see here. And I want to start off the conversation asking Lee a little bit about her process and how you started completely in watercolor. So I'm going to show an early watercolor from 2009, which is from travel that Lee had in India. So Lee, I'm going to ask how you got started with art and your choice of watercolor as a medium.
I actually originally worked in, or showed really, in oil. And it wasn't until I had my first child that I had always done studies in watercolor. And when I had my first child, I became increasingly uncomfortable having kind of paints and solvents and things on me, and had been talking to my New York gallerist, and he said, well, you just have such a great facility with watercolor. Why do they have to be small? Why don't you just start working bigger? And I think in an effort to sort of break out of the preciousness the way you can be sort of too precious with watercolors and stuff, I just went really big. So, this is a very large piece. That whole series was actually very large, very small and very large. And I just approached watercolor the way I would any other, painting medium. And then very quickly I found that I that I was adding inks and sometimes gouaches and other medium to the paper. But I've always worked in watercolor. I love it, and I've just sort of always had a facility for it. So, but I needed some pushing to feel like I could do a show of watercolors.
I mean, I want to again emphasize the size of this. This is very large, 51 by 98. For anyone who's worked in watercolor, it is not easy. First of all, watercolor is a very difficult medium to work with, but especially when you're working with something this large. Here are a few images from the Dreams of Dondridge, which was the first exhibition that we had of Lee, which was back in 2012. Do you want to tell us both a little bit about first Dondridge and then your watercolor process here?
So Dawnridge, I actually experienced it the first time at a Save Venice event and fell in love with it. And Hutton Wilkinson, who was a protege of Tony Duquette's, whose home it is now. And it's just a magical, mystical place, and with crazy colors and patterns and things. And I mean, people often ask me, how did you dream all of this stuff up? And I really didn't. Tony Duquette dreamed it up, and I just got to go there and do little sketches and watercolors and things. So I did most of the studies on site. That's generally how I work. I'll, when I'm traveling, I'll take a sketch pad with me, sometimes take a little camera. Nowadays, I pretty much just use my iPhone. But I had done several little sketches and then reached out to Hutton and asked if I could come. And I think I paid 2 or 3 visits where I stayed for a while doing drawings and then came home and did these pieces in my studio.
Yeah, you'll see these are also quite large, 40 by 26.
Yeah, and some of them were even bigger, as you remember. Some of
Yeah,
them
yeah.
were
Some of them were, I think, if I recall, 6 feet tall.
yeah.
And then
Yeah.
the interesting thing is it really does sort of capture the sort of the vibrancy of the color and the sort of exotic nature of the design, which I think is sort of the underlying theme in all of your work.
Yeah, I mean, I went to New York studio school where the focus was on drawing and getting the color right. And I'm less interested in getting the color right than getting the impression right and the feeling of a place right. Because, you know, the truest color it's not necessarily the feeling and the memory you have when you leave, right? I mean,
when I think that goes back to your quote too, which is interesting. Yeah. So I want to show an image here of these are some of the images that you take, and this leads into the other series that we had exhibited at the gallery, your Chimera series. And this is where I believe you start to change your process somewhat, and I'll put this slide up here. So if you want to talk about how you came about this process and what your thoughts are about these works.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in light and color and pattern. And for this series, for the first time, I, for various reasons, felt that I couldn't really travel and couldn't really go spend a long period of time someplace to work on sort of a new body of work. And so I kind of looked back at old drawings and old photographs, and then, you know, I used to be a decorator. My sister's a decorator. So I have all these fabric samples and wallpaper samples and things. And I just started kind of playing with them. And I don't think of them as collage, but I liked the idea of layering the patterns and the images. And so in a way, they are sort of collage. And then I started to integrate either photographs via the printing process, or I'd project and redraw line drawings that I had drawn in situ. And so I kind of began experimenting with that kind of layering, and but primarily painting on patterned papers, and kind of going from there. And again, sort of matching patterns that were reminiscent or recalled the location where the imagery was drawn from, so that again, it would kind of reinforce that feeling of that's what I remembered of that place.
So I think it's an interesting segue, this Shimmer series into your current work. These are some shots of your studio. So before I go to showing some of the final work, do you want to tell us how your process was for this series?
So this was a really big shift. And I think part of the reason for the shift really was that big COVID interlude. But I had begun talking actually with Judith and Paige Larson about different processes for creating patterns, because when I tried to go from the Shimmer series and to make larger works, I wasn't happy with the way you would see seams in paper. And so it became clear to me that I had to somehow create patterns on a large enough scale. And I've always struggled with the nature of, watercolor on paper having to be under glass. And through conversations with people, mostly on Zoom, and beginning to work with a young graduate art student with computer technology and how you can generate images and change images. Originally, I was doing it thinking that I'd be creating huge patterns, and then we did do some of that, but that became part of a bigger process of integrating photographic images, patterns we've created, textures we've created, images we've altered, and then sort of combining these layers digitally so that thanks to DSI and Eric, I was able to come up with a way to sort of make these ghost images of things that I'd put together on the computer so that I could use that really as sort of like a sketch or an underpainting for the paintings. And that's really how this work was made.
So here is one of the finished works, Brocade. What I think is fascinating about these, you need to see them. I always say that you can't, it's very hard to experience art through a digital image, because you need to experience, the sort of nature of it. And these have a particularly jewel-like quality because of the combination of how they are adhered to an aluminum plate, and then the sheen of the surface and the texture of the surface. And what I think, Lee, you had mentioned when we were talking earlier today, that this is the first time that you used single images, but did multiple interpretations of them. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, part by accident and part by some of the things that I was looking at the time. But the accident part would be that while we were experimenting with this process, which I was super excited about, because for the first time we were able to get special watercolor paper that I use. Digital Silver Imaging orders that paper now. They print a ghost version and then adhere that, mount it on aluminum, deliver that to me. I work on it, paint on it, then they come and pick it up, and then they seal it with a UV coating. They put it in a spray room and they spray it so that it doesn't have to have glass in front of it. But as a result, this is a studio that produces photography work. So they weren't used, they were used to producing finished images. So it took us a while to work together and come up with light enough images so that they, to my mind, at least when you see them, you can tell that there's some element of digital component, I think, but they really are paintings. But because I was getting multiple proofs, I really began to look back at painters like Morandi and stuff, who I'd never really understood in the past in terms of their obsession with the same image over and over again. But because I had these proofs that there was a very different way to explore an image in different color variations and in different light intensity. And it's just, it kind of is endless now. I see what he spent a lifetime doing now.
I think the process works very well with the concept. So do you want to talk a little bit about your idea of painting solely chandeliers, lanterns, light fixtures, and how that came about. Because I know that this is a sort of recurring thing, and I think maybe it was Cuba that you picked that up or came up with that concept. I'm going to show
Yeah, I mean,
another work. So
yeah, I think you know, I've always been interested in light and pattern. And so in both Cuba and Venice, in that show that I did with you, there was a lot of balustrades and wrought iron work from fences and then the light, you know, fixtures, because you really notice those things at night even more when the light is coming through. And I think I had done a few pieces in that Shimera series that had a chandelier element in them also. And I just got really fascinated with the abstract pattern that lights cast, particularly chandeliers. And it wasn't as if I sort of set off to do a series just on chandeliers, but it just kind of became really fascinating to me. And then I sort of started looking back at photographs I'd taken and drawings that I'd done, and just sort of reevaluating them and thinking about if I could still if I just focused in on them, could I still evoke that feeling of a specific place?
So, can you talk a little bit about what you're using in the backgrounds? Are they the ceilings? Are they tile patterns?
So they vary. So in some cases, they're patterns that I've created with the help of an assistant. And then, you know, the shadow patterns are drawn from life originally, but I may exaggerate them or you know, give them much more of a contrast. But the patterns are usually from somewhere in the vicinity of the locale of the chandelier. So this is a Fortuny fabric from Venice, and it's a Venetian chandelier. So I'm trying to reinforce that sense of place and feeling when I combine the patterns with the lights.
Are is most of the series from Venice, or were there other?
No, it's from all over. A lot of it is from Italy. I mean, because I've been fortunate enough to spend a fair amount of time there. The first one, Brocade, is actually from Paris. I believe 2 or 3 of the images are from New York. And in fact, at the opening, a friend of mine from high school walked into the gallery and said, "Oh my God, that looks just like mine." And I looked and I said, "Look at the title." And she said, "Oh my God, that is mine." So one of them's from Darien, Connecticut.
So do you have a favorite travel location that I think lends itself to your work more than others, or are you just traveling to all the most exotic, beautiful places in the world? Like,
I think that towns and cities, I mean, I love to be out in nature, and I love to travel in places like Africa and Montana and that kind of thing, and fly fish and do things like that. But I think that
well, I don't think I knew that.
yeah, but I find that sort of vast emptiness too daunting. I think I'm too interested in line and form and color. So I tend to like environments that are kind of busier, but I mean, it could be Palm Beach, Florida, with the great architecture, you know, but I tend to be drawn to, I mean, Paris is phenomenal, right? I haven't spent much time in Spain, but I'm sure I could go wild there. I could, you know, go spend some more time there. But I think a lot of it is drawn from Italy. Yeah, I mean, there's so many places on my list. You know, I'd love to get to Austria to do some drawings from there. I think that would add a whole nother dimension to the work.
Where is this one from?
So this is actually from New York.
Oh, okay.
And there are 2 from New York, one from a friend and one from a family member's home. And so it's actually an Aubusson carpet in a different room. But I just felt like it gives you the feeling that the impression of being in that home gives you.
Well, I think this is this slide in particular is a good example of the way in which a similar concept for an image can become 3 totally different works of art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially the one in the lower left-hand corner was kind of like a real departure for me. I mean, a friend of mine said it's a little Fragonardy, but I think it's just fun to sometimes play with that kind of painting and
So you've mentioned
the push and
more.
pull of, what you see and what you don't see of the pattern, right? I mean, because you still see the framework of the molding of the ceiling, you see the cast shadow, but it's fun to play with the picture plane in that way.
So you've mentioned Morandi, and you just and
I
Fragonard.
just said Fragonard, and it's funny because neither of them are really artists. Like if I think of my work and I think who I normally look to,
That's what
I
I was
look
going to ask.
Matisse, I look to, I look to Manet, I looked at colorists, I looked to, for this series, interestingly, I was actually looking back at a lot of early Ross Bleckner work.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting.
yeah, because I feel like a lot of my work can be very contrasty in terms of color and very bold. I mean, I've never had, I would say I'm a colorist, but I was really looking for a slightly more muted palette and a slightly more, just a little bit quieter. I just wanted a softer feeling to this work. I also teased that I think I maybe was channeling a little Tess Atkinson because I love her photographs and we've traveled and worked together before. So I think that might have had a big impact on me. I'm sure it did. Yeah.
So when you were working, would you work on sort of big and small simultaneously, or go back and forth between, focus on the small and focus on the large? And I'm just fascinated because they the smaller they have similar qualities, but the smaller ones are different than the bigger ones.
So I definitely would do a small one before doing a bigger one. And because this was my first time working in this manner, and it's very true, it took me several months and several pieces to get over kind of being too precious with them, because for the first time, when you're working on a canvas, you can just, if you need to start again, you gesso over. When for me, because I have a certain competence with watercolors, when I'm working on a paper, even if it's a really large piece of paper, I feel like I can fix mistakes. And worst case scenario is it's a piece of paper, right? It's not an inexpensive piece of paper, but it's a piece of paper. Because this process is so expensive that by the time I get the piece and begin working on it, I already have a lot invested in it. So I was being I mean, precious is the only word I can use. I was being so careful. And my normal working method is to have an idea in my head, to sort of loosely draw something out. And then as you're working with watercolors, you don't have full control over it. It's just, you can't. The nature of it is such that you don't. And so sort of going with those unforeseen things or the accidents is a big part of my process. But because of the way the paper is adhered to the aluminum, I have to be careful, and I have to work in a less wet and more layered manner. And so I just was so worried about, it took me a long time before I got to where I felt like I could be freer and use a little more water and kind of let things happen the way I normally do. But
Well, it's interesting because I think that,
still,
yeah, no. Well, what I was going to say is it's interesting to hear you say that, because there is a sort of more tighter nature to the smaller works, where the larger works are freer and more expressive. And I
yeah,
think in some ways, I mean, they both sort of have the qualities of the light dancing on the ceiling, but you really, for example, in this one, see it, which is currently in our window now, which brings people in because it's so bold. Um, but it's really interesting to me. I I was a little bit I wasn't sure how small and large would look next to each other, but it really works because they are completely, you know, unique in their way. And I know we're
yeah. I mean, I think it's the nature of big canvases and big pieces of paper. You use your whole arm instead of just your hand. You work differently. But in order to have that freedom to work in that manner on the larger scale, I had to figure things out a little bit more in advance, because you just don't have the same flexibility to mop up a color by pouring more water on it quickly, or any of the other methods that I use. If something starts to happen that I'm not thrilled with, there's just more flexibility when you're simply working on paper than there is with the paper mounted on the aluminum. So I think that caused a little bit of a difference that didn't exist before between the smaller and the larger works. But
Yeah, and I mean, for people that are not familiar with the process of either painting on canvas with oil or painting on paper with watercolor, these are all, if I'm correct, lying flat on the floor, and you're having to maneuver yourself around them.
oh yeah, I have like elbow pads, I have knee pads, I
Yeah, I
crawl
mean,
around.
I could imagine it would be a very fun, a very fun thing to watch, especially as
Yeah,
you're.
I need like one of those little ceiling mounted cameras and do like a time lapse thing. I
Yeah,
look like a
actually,
little skittering
that
around
would
my
probably
studio.
be a fun thing to do, a little performance piece
Yeah.
off of it. But one of the things that I like about this, and I think that this is just that I like about this process, because it is a process that I think I haven't seen it before. With watercolor and with paper, you get a lot of the undulation of the surface, and you become very aware of what what the material is, and I think in some ways the nature of the material sort of disappears in the way in which these become just sort of their own jewel-like objects. And it's very interesting, because I think my first reaction was, you know, is it a watercolor? Is it a painting, an acrylic painting? Is it a photograph? And so I think they're very successful in that way. And I do think that, for people that haven't been in the gallery, you should come in and see them this weekend while you still can, because again, when they have their own light playing on them from different angles, it really is something. I have to move my screens around. Yeah, this one in particular is very striking to me. Do you want to tell me about this one, and like what this fixture is and what the background is?
So the fixture is again from a private home, and then the pattern, actually I had to do a little homework to find the pattern, because it was a wallpaper but in a different room of the house. But the house had this sort of Orientalist feeling to it, and so I was able to track down the wallpaper, and I went and photographed the paper. And then I just felt like it looked too I don't know what would the word be. It felt too much like a photograph, by simply just because of the starkness and the geometry, I think, of the light fixture, to just combine it with a photographic image of a pattern. And so I added a wall, like a texture underneath it, and then we actually kind of warped the pattern a little bit, and then blew it out, and then I went in and painted it. So
So how did you create the texture?
I photographed a texture, and then we didn't really like the way that looked, so we kind of digitally altered it. And I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I couldn't do it without the help of this assistant, but it's amazing what you can do with, I mean, to some degree. I mean, we all saw it when we saw the Hockney in London and stuff. I mean, you can create whole paintings on iPads, right? I mean, that look like paintings, but I don't actually enjoy the digital process. I need to have my hand in it. So I just want to create the suggestion that then I can paint and play with. But I mean, I guess for artists that have the facility, that do their work completely digitally, it's amazing what you can do.
Yeah, this is truly one of the things, again, that I mentioned to you in the artist talk. It really is fascinating to see the evolution of your style. Um, you know, going back. I don't, yeah, I don't know if I ever saw when some of the work that you did when that was on canvas. Um, but it's really fascinating to me.
It's funny because I actually have a painting hanging in my kitchen that's very, very similar in terms of color to that previous piece. And it's got irises on top of in front of a wallpaper. I mean, it's clear. I think we talked about this a little bit before, but sometimes when I'm kind of moving along and feeling like I'm trying something new, I feel like I've gone off on a tangent a little bit, and I worry about where am I going with this? And yet when I stop and look back at all of this, it seems completely logical that this is where I would end up. And in fact, my son is about to introduce me to a gentleman who lives and works on the North Shore, who's a welder, because there are a few of the pieces in this show that I reverted back to using stencils. And so he has the ability, because he works on cars and other commercial fabrication, to create giant stencils for me so that I could use stencils that are the size of my work. So,
Oh, that's interesting. So
yeah.
that's the sort of next step in some of this. In this,
Yeah, so there was stencil work in the India series in some of
yeah,
the pieces. And so again, it's like any way to add more sort of depth and character in terms of the pattern and those elements, I'm interested in. And I think you have, I think you have some of the ones that I use that on here.
yeah.
I'll point them out when we get to them. So,
And can you tell me about this one? This is Sorrento.
oh
Um,
yeah.
I'm trying. Tell me about this one.
So this is actually, it is from Sorrento, and I don't believe that the light fixture is Geoponte, but the tile that is what I have, sort of behind it, in this image is from one of my favorite hotels. It's not a hotel that I stay in, but it has a restaurant that I love, and so yeah, so that's why this one's called Sorrento. Yeah.
I feel like what's that series that I haven't watched yet with Jennifer Coolidge?
The one that was filmed in Sicily, actually,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like this
Yeah.
could
I
be
mean,
that.
there's just so much eye candy, right? In Europe
Yeah.
and stuff, between the art and the architecture and every,
Well, I
I
know.
mean,
I
the
mean,
promenades.
As you know, I'm Italian American, and I'm an Italophile. So, Capri and Sorrento are two of my favorite places in the world.
Yeah.
So, and great for image sources too.
Yeah.
Um, what is this chandelier? White
So
Lotus.
that
White
is,
Lotus.
yeah, it does have that feeling. So that is also from Sorrento. And that is, it just reminded me of all the Geoponte interiors and stuff. Neither of these are actually Geoponte, but it just had that feeling. And the chandelier is actually from a villa in Lucca. I think it looks very French when you see it alone, but yeah.
You obviously, in addition to artists, have a very strong familiarity with designers, product designers, both fabric, chandeliers. How did that come about? Do you consider yourself an interior designer as well?
No, but I took a year after my freshman year in college and went up to New York and went to New York School of Interior Design. And after college, before I went to graduate school, I actually worked with an interior designer for a couple of years. So, and I care very much about my environment, and I love, I'm always looking, and so I'm just always interested in, furniture and, I mean, tableware, light fixtures, doorknobs, anything beautiful. I'm like a magpie.
So someone at the gallery asked me to ask you if you had to pick one light fixture to put in your home from your series, what would it be? The fixture itself.
The fixture itself.
Or do you have a favorite? You don't have to. That's like asking.
No, I do. I
It's
think,
like, who's your favorite child?
yeah, I mean, I think I love the one like two slides back. nope, that one. Yeah, because nope. Next one. Yeah. The cabaret, because it actually casts very different shadows depending on how light or dark it is in the room. And there's some movement to it. You know, when you open a door, those little crystals kind of move and stuff. So I like that.
I'm gonna go with my, I want, right, yeah, here's some of the small ones. This is, this group is particularly interesting to me, because this to me is the first image of, you know, what I think we all think of as the sort of traditional chandelier. Where was this one?
This one is actually from Florida, from Palm Beach, Florida.
Oh, okay. And I see you have some of your patterning in, on the one on the upper.
Yeah, so I did use a stencil on the top left piece, and played with that a little bit. And then this was really fun working on these, kind of playing with how much I wanted to focus on the chandelier itself and how much I wanted to focus on the cast shadow. And yeah, that was fun.
I just want to make sure I haven't screwed up the screen for anyone. You still see the 4 images, right, Lee?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Tell me about Darien. That one has had a lot of people interested in. Of course, it has sold. I should mention that we have sold quite a few. But there are still quite a few for sale. So I do invite everyone to come in and continue to collect. So tell me about this Darien.
Yeah, so that's a piece that is from Darien, Connecticut. And I was down visiting friends, and we went over to a girlfriend's house late, and it just caught my eye immediately. And I sat there sort of quickly scribbling and drawing a little, and took some pictures, and I knew I'd paint it when I got home.
Do we know who the designer of this chandelier is?
I have no idea. I mean, I think it's like a variation of one of those sort of Sputnik type feature,
Yeah.
pieces. But it just, because there were no other lights in the room, the way that it cast, and the house was dark. We had literally just run in to go grab something, and then ended up staying for a while because I wanted to draw it. And yeah, it's just a phenomenal cast shadow. I mean, when other lights are on in the room, you probably notice it a lot less.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also I think because it's, very close to the ceiling, a lot of those Sputniks are on a pole and hang down, so that they're not as close to the reflective surface. But that one was just phenomenal. Yeah. I think it looks very
pink
like
spiraling.
flower.
Pink spiraling, where is that?
That's actually on the Lido in Venice, on the island of Lido. Yeah, I was visiting that actually with my daughter, and it was sort of after the season, and the hotel was empty, and we'd gone out there for the day to go to the beach, and yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful. We won't go. Yeah. This one looks very New York, either New York or Palm Beach to me.
The ephemera is actually from Palm Beach. Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
Yeah. And then the Wellington is actually Long Island. Yeah.
You have what would you say was the most interesting chandelier that offered the most interesting opportunities to paint?
I mean, they're all really different, and yeah, they're all really different. So I think each one of them, I could keep going almost endlessly with variations on the theme. I think this one I particularly love just because in its own environment, it sort of had so many colors in it. And
Well, that's the
because
nature of the crystal too. And I
yeah,
think that the reflections of the crystal work well with the patterning of the background.
yeah, they were all really fun to work on. And some of these I mean, it's hard to see in this format, but some of these have, almost all of them have some element of pencil. A lot of them have inks in them because a lot of the first layers are ink, so that when I put on the following layers, they won't bleed too much because the ink is more stable than the watercolor. And then, you know, when I'm finishing, I often will go back in with some colored pencil, watercolor pencil, oil pastels. The one in the middle has quite a bit of oil pastel in it.
So do you see yourself continuing with chandelier? Obviously, I think the chandeliers have been a recurrent theme through all of your different series, but is there another? I know you've done balustrades and grates, ironwork. Are there other types of architectural elements that are of interest to you?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking again about, I mean, there's a lot more kind of chandeliers that I'd like to work on that I'm currently working on. So I think that will definitely continue for a while. I am liking the idea again, though, of sort of incorporating a little bit more of the architecture or the setting around the chandeliers again. I think it just makes for a little bit, it's just a different kind of image and it just feels different. I think this, I feel like I go back and forth between wanting to show more depth and then wanting to show less. I've also just recently started doing drawings of still lives again. So I can see sort of approaching still lifes in this manner, sort of floral still lives again in this manner. So
Oh, that would be interesting. So if I'm remembering correctly from the beginning of the talk, you started these at a time when you couldn't travel during the pandemic, correct?
Mhm.
So now where are you traveling to? Or do you?
Um, I'll be back in Italy this summer, and hoping to get to France. I've been spending a fair amount of time going back and forth to Florida. A lot of this for family reasons and stuff, visiting family. So
Yeah.
yeah, I've been starting to look actually more and more in Boston, actually. So there's some really interesting light fixtures in townhouses and outside of some of these buildings in Boston. So I've been looking a lot at those lately too. So
Yeah, I mean the pictures of the Boston Public Library are pretty interesting.
yeah, yeah.
Well, I like that
Yeah,
you.
there's just some really great light fixtures, even when you're just walking up Commonwealth Avenue or walking around Beacon Hill, you see that, you know, you, depending on the time of day you go and yeah.
That's one of the charms of Boston is that it has so much of that.
Oh, it really does. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just take a look. So one of the things when I'm doing the oh, I won't go to the slide. Yeah, when I'm doing these artist talks, I like to pretend a little bit like I'm in the actor's studio when he was asking questions, you know, like
Uh,
but one of the things I always like to ask is that, you know, what advice would you give to young artists? You know, if you had because one of the things that I say is that uh, successful artists, I think, approach their art as a practice, and it's something that they do every day, and it's not
oh, I
something.
definitely agree with that. I mean,
Yeah, and it's not something that's clear in your work, and it's it's always, you know, it's a rigorous practice I think you have to do, but that would be what I would say to a young artist. Do you have
yeah.
any sort of similar thing?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with that one because I think you just have to put in the time, right? And you just do the work, and there are days and days and days where it doesn't really come and it doesn't feel right, but you just have to put in the time, and eventually it does. But I think I had a teacher at New York Studio School, Joe Santori, who said to me once that, and I think it's particularly important right now because I think we're starting to see really sort of what I would call beautiful work again. I think there's been work kind of graduate schools and the focus of art has been sort of social and political commentary, I think, you know, and that's been very important, and it is very important, but I think making beautiful, well-crafted work is equally important. And I think Joe Santori said to me when I was in graduate school that, you know, don't think about what's out there. You don't think about reaching somebody else. If you are able to tap into that which is truly personal, you will speak to others, right? And I think right now students are really taught to speak to others. But I think if the dialogue is really connected with yourself, then you will speak to others, right? I mean, the
No,
truly
and
personal.
again, I think that that also goes back to your quote, which I think is really interesting. I agree with you. I think that I think that the pandemic was so traumatic, and leading up to it and then post that, there has been a lot of what I would call movement away from what I like to call it aesthetic beauty, because I this was not popular for me when I was, because I don't know if people know this about me, but I was trained as an architect and
Mhm.
actually worked as an architect for a long time. So I have some idea of how of how makers are taught. And there can be a pejorative associated with things that are too pretty.
Yeah.
And I think that that has to do with the time that we're in. But I think you're right. I think um, one has to make artwork that speaks to their own internal dialogue. And if they continue to do that, um, then that dialogue, I think, comes out to other people. Um,
Yeah, and I also I think in the same token, you can say something that's profound, but if you don't do it with craftsmanship and skill, it's not going to stand the test of time either, right? And so I think there's something what you were saying about put in the time and do the work. You have to develop those skills and that craft, right? And
well, I think
then to
that
serve it.
you're making the case of why you exhibit at Child's Gallery, because one of the things that I say is that I'm interested in artists that um are technically skilled, honing a technique, but also are working um within the traditions, but also interpreting them in new and interesting ways.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things that makes your work, in my opinion, contemporary, is all of the sort of layering of the different imagery that you have. And um, there's a lot that can be parsed through it, especially, if we think about, you know, looking at your early watercolors to the Shimera series to these. And, this in particular, the Darien, I mean, that is completely an abstract painting, as well as this pink spiraling. I mean, abstract in that, is it representationalism? I mean, is it representation? Is it abstraction? I think they're both. And
Mhm.
so I'm always interested myself in between the 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 tension between abstraction and representation. And that's what I think, a lot of these works do. Because if you squint, you don't really know if they're chandeliers.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And truly the thing that I'm most interested in is the cast shadows and the play. And I just kind of love the whimsy of that, right? Of the idea of how the light is dancing on the ceiling. And it's just that's what interested me most in this body of work.
Well, I want to congratulate you on accomplishing it's a large amount of work, and I know what is involved and how much time it takes. But it's also again, clearly, an evolution of your style, and I'm excited to, see where it continues to go. So I think I've covered a lot of our questions that I had. And um, so let me just check. So is there anything we're just at about uh, five of six? Is there anything you'd like to say in closing about your work?
No, I think we've pretty much covered a lot.
Well, I wanna again thank you. And it's nice, you know, on a personal level, um, post post pandemic, it's been hard to sort of get people back into this idea of coming together and seeing art. And the reception that we had with you um, reminded me of times past, you know, when the pandemic didn't happen and we were all just there enjoying ourselves and enjoying artwork.
Yeah, no, it was a wonderful night. It really
Yeah.
was.
So again, thank you. I want to go. I will get scolded by Catherine, our director, if I don't finish on this slide, which is our phone number, our website, and our hours, and to welcome everyone to come in for the last few days to see the exhibition, Dancing on the Ceiling. And Lee, I'd like to thank you for tonight,
Oh,
chatting with us, sharing your thoughts and your wonderful work.
thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.